The first night it happened, Luke Maddox woke with the kind of jolt that tears a man straight out of whatever dream he was building. His cabin was quiet, too quiet, in that desert basin way, where silence feels like pressure, like weight on the ribs. At first he thought the sound that cut through his sleep had been part of the dream, some fading echo of a past life. But then it came again, sharp and trembling, slicing cleanly across the night like a wire pulled too tight. A horse's whinny, long, rising, wavering on the edge between terror and calling. His horse, the new one. Luke pushed himself upright, heart punching against his sternum like a fist. The digital clock on the old crate beside his bed glowed a cold blue. 3:17 a.m. An hour he had no business being awake at, an hour that belonged to coyotes and broken spirits and men with regrets too heavy to sleep through. He cursed softly, pulled on his boots, and stepped outside into the brittle darkness. The air was cold enough to sting the inside of the nose. No wind, no moon, only the weak spill of stars above the desert valley. The silhouette of the corral sat about 40 yards away, dark and unmoving, except for the frantic shape tossing its head inside. Sadie, the mare with the glass-smooth coat and the enormous eyes that had looked at him with calm acceptance the day she arrived on his trailer. A week ago, she'd been the gentlest creature on the property. Tonight, she sounded like something was peeling the world apart around her. Luke hurried across the dirt, the gravel crunching beneath his boots in a rhythm that felt too loud. The closer he came, the clearer the noise grew, whinnying, yes, but not wild. Not panicked in the animal sense. There was something searching in it, a calling, a plea, as though she weren't frightened at all, but begging for someone to answer. When he reached the fence, she didn't bolt or shy. She stood rigid near the far corner, neck arched, ears pinned toward the empty pasture beyond the fence line. Every muscle in her body shook with restrained desperation. Her breath puffed in white bursts. Her eyes weren't rolling, weren't terrified. They were focused, fixed on something Luke couldn't see. Easy, girl. Easy now. His voice came out low, instinctive, the tone of a man trying not to spook the dark. Ain't nothing out there. But the lie tasted wrong. He felt it immediately. The way the hairs rose at the back of his neck. The sensation, not of being watched, but of arriving too late to something. Like walking into a room where someone has just slipped out the back door. There was a residue to the silence, a charged emptiness. Sadie's tail flicked, and she let out another trembling call aimed straight into the blackness beyond the corral. Luke followed her gaze. The land rolled gently downward before climbing toward the red cliffs a mile out. Sagebrush, dark clumps of juniper, pale sand, all still. But the emptiness felt dense like a curtain pulled tight. He waited a long minute, breath steaming. Nothing. No movement, no rustle of brush, no coyote cry. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. The whole desert felt dislocated, as though it had stepped out of time for a moment. Luke murmured soft nonsense to the mare until she finally lowered her head, though she kept her body angled toward the darkness. He checked her legs, her feed, her water, searching for any normal reason for the outburst. Nothing seemed disturbed. When he returned to the cabin, he told himself it had been a fluke, a nightmare left over from her previous owner. Maybe. Animals carried memories like humans carried scars. He could accept that. But the next night, when his body lurched awake again at precisely 3:17 a.m., he felt a cold slice of something like fate slide into him. Sadie was calling again. Same exact pitch. Same trembling ache. Same direction. He went out faster this time, not bothering with a jacket. The chill bit at his skin as he stepped onto the porch. The sound hit him immediately, stabbing across the dry stillness. There was urgency in it now, a rawness that hadn't been there the night before. Not fear. No, some darker shade of longing. He jogged to the corral. Sadie was in the same corner, staring at the same patch of desert as if the world ended there. Her body shook harder tonight. Her hooves dug furrows in the sand. And when Luke placed a hand on her neck, she didn't even flinch. She simply kept staring, calling, waiting. He followed her gaze again, forcing his eyes to adjust. Still nothing. Darkness. Stars. Quiet. But then, just for a moment, he caught a flicker. Not movement, more like distortion. The way heat shifts the air above asphalt. A faint, wavering bend in the darkness, gone as quickly as it had appeared. Luke blinked hard, but the night was solid again. He stayed outside with her until nearly dawn. Only when the eastern sky began to pale did Sadie finally lower her head with a shuddering exhale, as though whatever she had been waiting for had given up on arriving. By the third night, Luke's nerves were frayed. He sat awake in bed after midnight, boots on, jacket close, listening for anything, the soft click of the heater, the shifting of the rafters, the distant howl of desert wind. His thoughts circled like wolves. Her previous owner, the strange skittishness Sadie sometimes showed at dusk, the way she pressed her head into the stall door when she heard footsteps outside. When the clock digits rolled quietly from 3:16 to 3:17, the whinny ripped through the night exactly on cue. Luke didn't walk this time. He ran. Sadie was already at the corner of the fence, head high, breath clouding, calling into the night with a frantic, aching rhythm. And this time, Luke felt at the moment he arrived, there was something in the air with them. The desert was wrong. Too still. Too heavy. A low hum in the atmosphere, like the world was holding a note he couldn't hear but could feel deep in his bones. He stepped closer to the fence and froze. In the distance, far beyond the pasture line, the outline of the old East Trail was faintly visible, a pale, winding scar in the land. A trail few people used anymore because it led to nothing but a collapsed barn and the remains of an abandoned ranch. But tonight it felt alive somehow, as if something had just moved along it. Something tall, something slow. Sadie let out a strangled cry that ripped through Luke's chest. It wasn't fear. He felt that clearly now. It was recognition. "Who are you calling?" he whispered into the night, voice trembling against his own will. "What's out there, girl?" The darkness didn't answer, but something in it shifted, some memory, some presence, some invisible shape that unsettled the air. Luke backed away slowly, and Sadie pressed against the fence rails, watching him with eyes that seemed to plead for understanding. Inside his cabin, he poured a drink with shaking hands. The glass clinked against the bottleneck. He barely tasted the whiskey. His mind was already running ahead, racing down possibilities he didn't want to believe. Animals didn't call into nothing. They called to someone. And whatever Sadie was calling every night at 3:17 a.m., it was drawing closer. Luke slept in fragments over the next 24 hours, drifting in and out like a man trying to rest on the edge of a cliff. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the faint distortion he'd glimpsed in the desert, like a figure made of heat, wavering, bending the air. And always Sadie's voice echoed after it, that raw, shaking whinny that sounded more like mourning than panic. By late afternoon, he found himself sitting on the cabin steps, elbows on his knees, watching the mare graze in the pale winter light. She moved like a creature half tethered to this world, and half to something far beyond its edges. Her ears flicked at sounds he couldn't hear. Her gaze drifted to the East Trail with a longing that made something inside him twist. The sun dipped low behind the rust-colored cliffs, staining everything with a bloody orange glow. Shadows stretched thin and long across the ground, dragging the cold with them. Luke stayed outside long after the temperature dropped, pretending he wasn't waiting for nightfall, pretending the desert wasn't breathing differently now. But as hours crawled by and the light drained from the world, a pressure settled into the air again, same as the last 3 nights. Thick, charged like a cord pulled taut. By the time he stepped inside, the cabin felt smaller, walls pressing close. He moved through the motions, heating a can of chili, rinsing out a mug, checking the clock every few minutes, without registering any of it. His nerves prickled with the awareness of the hour creeping closer. 3:17 had become more than a time. It had become a horizon he couldn't see past. When he finally sat on the edge of his bed, boots still on, jacket unbuttoned but ready, the minutes seemed to slow down, stretching themselves thin. 2:59, 3:03, 3:10. His breath came shallow and steady. He hated how tense he felt, how braced. Like a man waiting for a phone call he already feared he understood. At 3:16, the silence became absolute. And when the clock blinked over to 3:17, the sound rose, not abruptly, but almost mournfully, as if Sadie had been holding it inside her chest all day, waiting for the exact second to let it escape. Luke's body reacted before his mind could. He grabbed the lantern and was out the door in seconds, boots pounding the dirt, cold slicing across his face, so sharply he hardly felt it. The moment he reached the corral, he saw her, head thrown high, muscles quivering, breath pouring out in frantic bursts. But tonight was different. Tonight, she wasn't just calling. She was moving. The mare paced the fence line, circling like something was pulling her from the inside out. Her tail whipped sharply, her ears flicking with restless precision as she kept returning her gaze to that same dark stretch of desert. Her body trembled with a force that went beyond nerves. This was instinct, memory, recognition. She knew something out there. She wanted something out there. And she stopped all at once, frozen mid-step, every muscle locked. Luke lifted the lantern. The night didn't shift, but something else did. Far out along the east trail, where the moonlight barely reached, the air wavered. Just a thin ripple at first, like the world exhaling. Then another. Luke narrowed his eyes, breath catching. The distortion he'd glimpsed before was back, but clearer now, more stable, almost forming shape. Not quite human, not quite animal. Something upright, something tall. A silhouette made of trembling heat and darkness. His skin crawled. The lantern light shook in his hand. Sadie let out a low, aching sound that didn't sound like any horse Luke had ever heard. She stepped forward until her chest pressed into the fence rails, stretching her neck as far as she could, silently pleading for whatever stood on that trail to come closer. Luke's mind raced. The mare's previous owner had died. That much he knew. A ranch accident, they'd told him. A fall. A body found alone near that abandoned barn on the East Trail. It had seemed like tragedy at the time. Simple, awful, but not mysterious. Now the pieces rearranged themselves with sickening clarity. Horses felt things differently. They carried bonds through more than memory. They carried them through soul. Luke swallowed hard, forcing air back into his lungs. "If you're real," he whispered into the night. Though he didn't know who he was speaking to, "you need to stay where you are." He wasn't sure if he believed it, or if anything out there gave a damn about what he asked. The shape pulsed faintly, as if flickering through different states of being. A cold heaviness rolled over Luke, pushing against him like a tide. Sadie's hooves danced anxiously. She threw her head, calling again, calling harder than before. Her voice cracked with the force of it. And then, something answered. Not a human voice, not an animal sound. Something low, resonant, vibrating through the ground beneath Luke's boots. A frequency rather than a sound. A recognition. A reply. Sadie's entire body jolted. She reared back, front legs striking the air before she crashed down again, snorting violently. The corral fence shook under her weight. "Sadie." Luke grabbed the top rail, heart hammering. "Easy, easy, girl." But the mare wasn't out of control. She wasn't panicking. She was fighting something inside her, something that wanted to break free and run to the thing calling from the trail. Luke stepped into the corral without thinking. He moved slowly, careful not to startle her further, but she barely noticed him. Her gaze stayed fixed on the far darkness, her chest rising and falling in frantic shudders. He reached out, resting a hand against her trembling neck. Her skin was cold with fear or anticipation. Her muscles twitched under his palm like coiled wires. He pressed his forehead briefly against her shoulder, grounding himself in her warmth, in the realness of her body. "Whatever you're seeing," he murmured into her mane, "I can't let you go to it." But even as he said it, he felt the truth sink in like lead. This wasn't about permission. This wasn't something he controlled. There was a bond here older than his involvement, deeper than ownership. Something had been torn apart long before Sadie ended up on his trailer, and every night at 3:17, she reached toward that missing piece. The vibration in the air rose again, so subtle but undeniable. Luke lifted his head, staring hard at the east trail, and in the dim moonlight, he finally saw enough to understand. The silhouette wasn't approaching. It was waiting, as if expecting her, as if calling her home. Sadie let out one last heart-wrenching cry and collapsed to her knees. Luke fell beside her, arms around her neck as she shook violently, the invisible tether pulling at her until Dawn's first breath finally broke whatever hold the night had over the valley. Only then did she go still, exhaling a long, shuddering breath against Luke's chest. And far out on the trail, the shape dissolved into nothing. Luke didn't sleep after that. He didn't blink. He didn't move from the mare's side as the sky slowly brightened with the sickly, uncertain colors of early morning. Because now he knew Sadie wasn't calling to a ghost. She was calling to someone who didn't realize he was dead. By the time the sun lifted fully above the desert horizon, Luke felt as though he'd lived 3 lifetimes in one night. His body ached from holding Sadie through her collapse. His eyes burned from sleeplessness. And yet his mind refused to drift toward anything resembling rest. Instead, it replayed the impossible image on a relentless loop. The shape on the east trail, the way the air rippled around it, the way it seemed to wait rather than wander. And most of all, the way Sadie had fought to answer it, not with fear, but with recognition, like a creature who'd finally heard the voice she'd been longing for. When the mare finally rose, stiff but steady, Dawn clung to her coat in a gray-blue shimmer. Luke ran a hand down her neck, relieved to feel her breathing slower now, her heartbeat no longer thunder under her skin. She nuzzled his shoulder once, soft and tired, then turned her gaze to the sunrise. No tremors, no frantic passing. Just a heavy, sorrowful calm. He led her to the trough, watched her drink, watched her chew a few bites of hay with half-hearted interest. But he knew her peace was temporary. Night would come again, and the desert would call again, and at 3:17, she would feel it like a hook buried deep in her chest. Luke couldn't stomach the thought of watching her tear herself apart another night. So he turned to the only thing he could do: investigate. The old ranch barn, what remained of it, lay miles out along that east trail. He'd never walked it himself. He'd only heard the story from the previous owner. A freak accident, a fall from a loft, a man alone, a horse watching helplessly below. When Luke signed the purchase documents for Sadie, none of that had seemed relevant. Now it felt like the center point of a map he'd been blind to. He saddled his truck with supplies, enough water for both him and Sadie, and led the mare to the open gate. She hesitated, ears tilting toward the trail, then back toward him. Luke rested his forehead against hers, feeling that thin line of trust holding them together. "Let's go find out what's calling you," he whispered. The desert in winter was a strange place, too cold for comfort, too open for safety. The sky felt heavier over the valley, the distant mesas sharp as broken teeth. Luke guided Sadie down the trail, boots crunching over frost-stiffened earth. The silence wasn't peaceful, but anticipatory, like the world holding its breath. Half a mile in, he noticed the tracks. Not fresh, but not old either. Boot prints, stark gerät, spaced unevenly. A man walking alone, or limping, dragging one leg just enough to leave thin grooves beside each imprint. Sadie stopped dead when her hooves reached the first mark. Her breath hitched. Her ears rotated forward with intense precision, as though she recognized the pattern of the print itself. She lowered her nose to it, inhaled and exhaled a broken, trembling sound Luke had only heard once before, when she'd first arrived at his ranch and found her old halter in the gear bag. A bond wasn't a memory. A bond was a scar. He crouched beside the print, tracing the worn edges with gloved fingers. This was him, wasn't it? He murmured. Sadie's body leaned subtly toward the imprint in answer. They followed the trail of footsteps through winding sands, up a shallow rise, and down toward a cluster of brittle shrubs. The tracks became erratic here, looping, doubling back, as if the man had been disoriented or panicking. Then all at once they stopped. Luke stood, looking around the empty landscape, his chest tightening with the cold realization that he didn't know whether he was chasing an echo or something living. The wind picked up, slicing past with a whistle that sounded almost like a distant voice. Sadie tossed her head sharply, muscles tense again. Her nostrils flared, her ears pinned back and then shot forward. Luke followed her gaze and saw the barn. The structure was barely standing. Roof fallen in on one side, splintered boards jutting like fractured ribs. An old corral sat beside it, the rails leaning drunkenly, half consumed by time. A lone tumble of rusted wire curled near the entrance. Everything about the place felt wrong, not broken in the way old buildings break, but disturbed, as if the desert itself had recoiled from it. Sadie took one step forward, trembling, then another. Luke swallowed hard. He moved slowly, scanning the area, every instinct warning him that he wasn't alone. The air here was thicker, colder. He could almost feel a presence, not malicious, not threatening, but lost. Desperate. Waiting. Inside the barn, the air changed again. Warmer. Still. Heavy with dust and something faintly sweet, like old hay left to rot. The interior beams were splintered but intact enough to hold a slanted ceiling. Shafts of pale light streamed through the gaps in the walls, illuminating floating motes. Then Luke saw the rope. It hung from the upper loft, frayed at the end, looped once like a harness or halter tie. The boards around it were cracked, broken in a wide, splintered pattern as though something, or someone, had fallen hard. His stomach twisted. He stepped forward, running a hand along the shattered wood. Sadie let out a soft, guttural sound behind him. Not fear, grief. This is where it happened, Luke whispered. He moved toward the back of the barn, where dusty remnants of old life lay untouched. A torn jacket sleeve, a coffee tin half buried under hay, a photograph frame lying face down in the dirt. Luke picked it up, brushed off the dust. A man smiled from the faded image, broad-shouldered, sunburnt, a kind grin crinkling his eyes. His arm was around Sadie, her coat glossy, her head tucked against his chest as if she belonged nowhere else. Luke exhaled shakily. "That's him," he said aloud, voice cracking without his permission. "That's who you're calling." Sadie stepped beside him and nudged the photograph gently with her muzzle. He turned it over and froze. Scratched into the back, faint but unmistakable, were 3 words. "I'm not gone." Luke's breath caught. His pulse hammered. The barn seemed to shrink around him, the air vibrating faintly with the same impossible frequency he'd felt the night before. A pressure pushed against his ears, subtle but insistent, like someone standing too close. Sadie lifted her head suddenly, ears pricking toward the doorway. Luke followed her gaze. A shadow stood just beyond the barn entrance. Not the rippling heat shape from the night, but something more defined now. A tall silhouette. Shoulders. Arms. A head bowed slightly, as if observing with quiet grief. The figure didn't move. Sadie didn't breathe. Luke's voice somehow found its way up his throat. "If you're here, show yourself." The wind died completely. The figure shifted, and for the first time, Luke saw the outline of face, blurred, indistinct, but infused with an emotion that struck him like a punch. Longing, recognition, an unspoken plea. Sadie stepped toward it. Luke instinctively reached for her halter, but stopped halfway. Something inside him, something old, something intuitive, knew this wasn't a threat. Knew this wasn't a haunting, but a man caught between worlds, unable to leave what he loved. The figure raised an arm. Not fully, just a small, almost invisible motion. Sadie's breath shuddered violently. Luke's lantern flickered, and the silhouette dissolved into a swirl of dust and cold air. Sadie didn't move for a long time. Luke didn't either. They simply stood there, staring at the empty doorway. The desert beyond it stretched in silent, breathless expectation. Finally, Luke exhaled. "We need to find out what really happened to him," he whispered, "because this wasn't an accident, and the dead man wasn't resting." Luke didn't return to the ranch right away. Something in him resisted the idea of stepping back into the ordinary world when nothing about what he had witnessed felt ordinary anymore. The desert around the old barn seemed charged with a strange, electric stillness, like a place holding its breath, like a memory trying desperately not to fade. Sadie walked beside him through the dry chill, her head lower than usual, her steps slower. She no longer trembled, no longer fought the invisible pull that had tormented her for nights, but she also moved as though each stride weighed more than the last. As if passing through that barn had drained something out of her, something she hadn't realized she had left to lose. By the time they reached the ridge overlooking the valley, the late afternoon sun painted the vast sands with long strokes of amber and rose. Luke paused there, breath catching at the sight, not because of the beauty of the sunset, though it was stunning, but because Sadie stopped beside him and lifted her head fully for the first time since dawn. She stared out toward the barn, her ears twisting forward, her eyes sharp despite the exhaustion. She looked not fearful, but alert, watchful, like she expected someone to walk up that trail at any moment. Luke followed her gaze. Nothing moved in the distance. No figure, no dust, no sign that the shadow he'd seen was anything more than a trick of grief and cold in memory. But he wasn't a fool, and he wasn't imagining things. He knew what he'd seen. He knew what had looked back at him. The wind brushed against them, whispering through the brittle desert shrubs, swirling in brief circles before scattering across the dry earth. Sadie snorted softly and took a step closer to him, as if seeking reassurance or offering it. It was hard to tell which. Luke laid a hand on her neck, feeling the faint tremor still lingering beneath her skin. "I'm going to find out who he was," Luke murmured, "and what happened to him, and why he's still here." He said it to Sadie, but the words felt larger, as though they'd settled into the air around him, absorbed by the silence that hovered just beyond the reach of the wind. The drive back to the ranch felt longer than usual. Shadows stretched along the dirt road, bending and warping under the headlights. Every time the truck dipped into a small valley, Sadie's ears swiveled, and Luke's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He couldn't shake the sensation that they were being watched, not maliciously, but with intent, with longing, as though someone followed them from a distance, just out of sight, carried by the desert night. When they reached the ranch, the sky had deepened into indigo, and the first stars pricked through the darkness. The porch light flickered once when Luke approached the house. He paused, staring at it. It flickered again, then glowed steadily. A coincidence. It had to be. Old wiring. Nothing more. Sadie refused to enter her stall at first. She stood at the threshold, chest tightening with a soft, uneasy grunt. Her tail swept low, her muscles tightening. Luke didn't push her, didn't force her. He let her stand there, breathing in the familiar scent of hay and pine shavings, until finally she exhaled and stepped inside. He latched the door gently, stroking her muzzle when she pressed it against the bars. "Tonight, I'm staying right here," he told her. "You're not going through all that again alone." He pulled an old folding chair out of storage, set it just outside her stall, wrapped himself in a blanket, and set the lantern beside him. The flame cast a warm glow across the barn, throwing soft shadows over stacked bales and used tack in Sadie's tired eyes. She watched him as he settled in, then lowered her head into the hay, her breath steady, her movements calm. She seemed almost peaceful again. Almost. Hours passed. Luke drifted in and out of shallow rest, counting the creaks of the rafters, the shifting of Sadie's weight, the distant call of a night bird. Midnight rolled by without incident. 1:30 came and went in silence. The air grew colder, brittle enough that Luke's breath fogged faintly in the lantern light. Sadie slept fitfully, twitching at times as though dreaming of running or falling or calling for someone. Then the lantern dimmed, not suddenly, not like a gust had blown it, but softly, deliberately, like a hand brushing over the flame. Luke sat up, heart pounding, eyes scanning the barn. Something in the air changed. It thickened, pressed inward, carrying a faint tremor that slid along his skin. He stood, instinctively stepping closer to Sadie's stall. She woke instantly, not with fear, but with the raw, aching alertness of a creature sensing exactly what was coming. Luke checked his phone. 3:15 a.m. 2 minutes. Sadie lifted her head, ears pricked, chest rising rapidly. Her breath came faster, not panicked but expectant. She stared past Luke, toward the open barn doors, where the faintest sliver of moonlight spilled onto the dirt floor like a silver path. The lantern dimmed further. 3:16. Luke moved closer to Sadie, resting a hand against her neck. Her muscles tightened under his palm, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she pressed into him, her eyes still fixed on the barn entrance. "Whatever you're hearing," he whispered, "you're not answering it alone." She flicked her ears once. And then it came, a sound so soft Luke almost missed it beneath the whisper of the night breeze. A voice, muffled, distant, carried on the shifting air like memory-made sound. It wasn't a word. It wasn't even clear, but it was a summons, a call from somewhere just outside the barn. Sadie's breath hitched violently. She stepped backward, then forward again, torn between movement and stillness. The voice brushed against the edge of hearing once more, gentle, pleading, familiar. Luke's blood froze. 3:17 a.m. Sadie let out a low, trembling whinny, not the frantic cry from previous nights, but a soft, broken reply. The air at the barn entrance stirred, and a figure stepped through. Luke didn't breathe. He didn't speak. He didn't move, because the man who had died in the old barn, the man Sadie mourned, the man whose shadow wandered the desert, was standing in the doorway. Not a blur, not a wisp, not a ghostly distortion. A person, dimly, half there, half not, his face strained with emotion, his posture pleading. Sadie took one step toward him. Luke instinctively reached for her halter, but stopped when the figure lifted a trembling hand. Not to call Sadie, not to beckon her, to warn. Luke felt it more than heard it. A pressure, a pulse, a silent, urgent command. Run. But from what? Luke turned and saw movement in the dark outside. Fast, too fast. Not human, not spirit. Something else, something alive, and it was coming straight for them. The creature burst through the darkness with a speed that shattered every fragile line between fear and instinct. Luke barely had time to shove himself in front of Sadie when the loose boards at the far end of the barn rattled violently, dust exploding from the rafters. Sadie reared back with a terrified cry, hooves striking air, her body twisting in panic. Luke grabbed her halter, steadying her as best he could, but she was trembling so violently he felt the tremors through his entire arm. His breath came out in cold bursts, his mind scrambling for sense, for shape, for something to identify the threat. The desert had predators, yes, cougars, coyotes, but nothing moved like this. Nothing carried this heavy, suffocating presence. Nothing made the air feel too thick to breathe. The figure in the doorway, the ghost, the memory, the man Sadie loved, staggered back, flickering like a flame in wind. His mouth moved, forming a warning Luke could feel reverberating in his bones. Run, not whispered, not spoken, but burning inside Luke's skull as clearly as if screamed. Sadie lurched forward, desperate to reach him, her hooves scraping against the wood. And the man's expression twisted in anguish, not at the darkness charging toward them, but at her, at the horse who still answered his call, who still loved him enough to chase a shadow into death. Luke wrapped both arms around her neck, pulling her toward him with a strength born not of courage but terror. Sadie, no. Stay with me, stay. She fought him for a heartbeat, all muscle and desperation. But then something shifted. The figure lifted a faint, trembling hand and pressed it to his chest. Not touching, not truly, just mimicking the motion as though placing a hand right above where a heartbeat should be. Sadie stopped instantly. Her trembling changed. Her entire body softened with longing and grief, so deep it hollowed the air around her. The creature hit the fence outside with a snarl that shook the barn. Wood splintered with a deafening crack. The lantern sputtered violently, shadows lashing across the walls like black fire. Luke pushed Sadie behind him again, though it was useless. Whatever was coming could tear through him like nothing. Then he felt it. The ghost wasn't fading. He was bracing. The air around Sadie pulsed with heat and cold at once, a vortex forming around her hooves. The figure stepped forward, not fully, not physically, but with force, with intent. His outline glowed faintly, a pale amber like old sunlight trapped in glass. Sadie's ears shot forward, but this time not in fear, in recognition, in readiness. The creature lunged through the shattered boards. A cougar, larger than Luke had ever seen, gaunt with hunger, its winter-starved body drawn tight over sharp ribs. Its eyes reflected the lantern light with a sickly green glare. It was driven by desperation, nothing more. Desperation so raw it had turned savage. It had no idea what it had charged into. It had no idea it was rushing straight into the grief of beings who refused to lose each other again. The ghost stepped fully between Sadie and the predator just as the cougar leapt. Luke saw the impossible, saw the man's outline flare brighter than the lantern flame, saw Sadie rear behind him, heard her scream in a voice ripped from the deepest part of her soul. The cougar's body convulsed mid-air as if striking something solid, something burning, something it could not understand. It crashed sideways into the stall door, sliding across the floor with a furious snarl. The ghost staggered, his form flickering wildly like a candle about to extinguish. "No, no, stay," Luke shouted to him, without realizing it until the words left his mouth. The figure turned his head toward Luke. For the first time, Luke saw his face clearly, late 30s, sun-lined, kind eyes now full of sorrow, a quiet resignation etched into every faded contour. He mouthed one word, "Protect." Then he drifted back towards Sadie. She lowered her head until her muzzle nearly touched his chest. She breathed against him, not air, but devotion, memory, pain, love. And as she did, her trembling steadied. Her stance widened, her ears fixed with fierce determination. The cougar recovered and lunged again. But Sadie was no longer frozen. She surged forward with a power Luke had never seen in her. Not wild, not panicked, but purposeful. She struck the ground with both front hooves, shaking the floorboards, sending up a burst of dust. The cougar skidded, weaving to avoid her. Luke grabbed a rake from the wall and slammed it against the ground with everything in him, shouting to draw its attention. The animal spun toward him with a hiss, its muscles coiling for another leap. The ghost moved again. This time it didn't push the predator or block it. It pushed Luke. Hard. Luke stumbled sideways just as the cougar sprang where he'd been standing. Sadie lunged, teeth bared, ears pinned flat, striking out with a kick that connected with a sickening crack. The cougar yelped, collapsing onto its side, scrambling backward in a clumsy, panicked retreat. It bolted through the broken boards and vanished into the desert, its shadow shrinking into the night until it was nothing more than a memory of violence. Silence slammed into the barn with the force of a wave. Luke panted, chest heaving, sweat chilling against his skin. Sadie trembled once, then let out a long, broken exhale. The lantern flickered uncertainly before steadying again, its warm light sweeping the ghost's form. He was fading, rapidly. "No," Luke breathed. "Please, don't go. She needs." But the ghost wasn't looking at Luke anymore. He looked only at Sadie, his gaze softening into something so full of love that Luke felt like an intruder witnessing it. He mouthed something again, and though Luke couldn't hear it, Sadie understood. Her ears twitched, her breathing hitched, and she pressed her forehead toward him, though her muzzle touched only empty air. The man stepped back, the barn light passing cleanly through his fading outline. His gaze lingered one last time on Sadie. Then, with the gentlest bow of his head, a gesture of gratitude, of apology, of farewell, his form dissolved into a warm flicker that drifted upward like a grain of dust caught in sunlight. And he was gone. Sadie let out a sound Luke had never heard from any horse. Soft, low, mournful, but not broken, not despairing. It was acceptance. It was goodbye. Luke pressed his forehead against hers, both of them trembling from exhaustion and the weight of everything that had just happened. The barn, finally still, seemed to exhale. The next morning, the sun rose into a quiet desert glazed with gold. Sadie stepped into the light calmer than she had been in weeks, her eyes clear, her steps steady. She paused once at the edge of the paddock, looking east toward the ruined barn where her old companion had died, but she did not call for him. She did not tremble. She simply stood there, her mane rippling in the breeze, her expression soft with a peace earned through fear and fire and love that refused to die. Luke stood beside her, letting the silence settle gently around them. "I think he stayed as long as he needed to," Luke whispered. Sadie nudged his shoulder, a small, warm affirmation. And for the first time since the night she had begun her cries at 3:17 a.m., the ranch felt whole again.